Starting today, if you go to a restaurant in New York City, you'll likely see a salt shaker warning on some menus.
Restaurant chains with at least 15 outlets are required to put a warning label next to items that have more salt than the recommended daily limit of 2,300 milligrams. Dr. Jonathan Newman, cardiologist and assistant professor at the New York University School of Medicine, is here to break it down for us. Dr. Newman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this sounds very similar to the calorie labels that we've seen on boxes of certain foods over the years, and that doesn't really keep people from eating too much. Do you really think this is going to help people with salt?
So I think it's a very good question. I think one of the things that the salt labeling will do is point out to people how much salt is in food that they may not be aware of. For instance, whole wheat bread can have more salt than a bag of potato chips. And it will be useful to get some labeling about prepared foods, which makes up about 70 to 80% of our salt intake, of how much salt is actually in the food that you're buying at restaurants with a number of chains around New York or elsewhere.
Okay, we just want to give people an idea, Doctor, of how much we're talking about. We're talking about the recommended daily limit. It's 1 teaspoon or 2,300 milligrams. I don't know if you all can see that there. You know, for some people, that might seem to be a lot. I mean, there's no way someone's going to go ahead and dump all of that salt on one dish at a restaurant, for instance. I mean, why is it so necessary for them and the best way for them to monitor their intake?
So I think one of the things that example brings up is that it looks like a small amount, but if you were making your food at home for a day, it would be difficult, I think, for you to put a teaspoon of salt on all your food. But the food that we buy when we eat at restaurants, when you buy food from stores, has much more than that salt, and the average American eats 2 to 3 times the recommended daily intake of salt a day, which we know is very tightly linked to the development of high blood pressure, a very important cause of stroke and heart disease around the country and around the world.
Does this come down to moderation, basically, with like everything else? Let's say you're sitting down, you want a few potato chips, and you take a handful, but maybe don't take 5 handfuls.
So I think you bring up a good question. Sort of moderation and variety is the spice of life, so to speak. But I think one of the things that the salt shaker and the salt warning labels will do is to give information to consumers about their food choices. And whether or not that's going to lead to big changes in salt intake, we don't know. Evidence would suggest that it will, and may have meaningful impacts on risk factors for heart disease, like high blood pressure. You
know, when you think about salt intake, I'm not sure a lot of young people especially pay attention to that.
Sure.
And especially if you're talking about going out to a restaurant, they might maybe look at the calorie count and
Sure.
say, oh, maybe I'll pass. But I mean, can this really, you think, be effective when it comes to reaching young people?
So that's a really interesting question. I mean, we know that heart disease, the risk factors for heart disease start when you're young, and that reductions over the lifetime, over a long period of time in your amount of salt intake can have very meaningful impacts on your future risk of heart disease. So it may be giving information to people to say, wow, I didn't realize that that sandwich at Quiznos had twice my daily intake of salt. I should think about potentially other healthy options to eat. And over the course of a lifetime, hopefully it will have meaningful impacts.
Good advice. Dr. Jonathan Newman from NYU. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.